But like, why is that? Why is an example of an inconsistent set of laws in a country, say, why is that any more significant than a book where some author writes two sentences that are contradictory to one another? I mean, could you really point to that book and say, look, I've proven gluts? I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem that significant, even though I might
Yeah, yeah,
struggle
yeah.
to spell out why.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's excellent. So you and I are sitting in exactly the same position on this.
Okay.
And in fact, the way you put it is interesting because it's the way I've looked at it really myself.
JC Beall, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Do you find that people have an overtly emotional reaction to the claim that a contradiction could literally be true? Do you think that accounts for some of the resistance to that position?
Emotional? I don't think it's emotional. I hope not. I think sometimes terminology gets confusing. So if you spell out what you mean by a contradiction, which is any formal contradiction of the form, it is true that P and it is false that P, where the and there is logical conjunction and the it is false that is logical negation, and even though it's often omitted because it's logically redundant, the it is true that is logic's truth connective, or logical nullation, as it's sometimes called. So a contradiction is just any sentence of the form, it is true that P and it is false that P. And once you spell that out, then I don't know. I've never seen emotional reactions to it, unless by like emotional reaction you mean something like what Lewis called an incredulous stare.
Yes. Yes.
But I mean, at this point, I don't know. Anyone in philosophy certainly won't have that response. Um, um, and people who aren't in philosophy, well, give them the latest physics or the latest biology or whatever, and they'll have an incredulous stare. I mean, when you have the luxury of digging deeper into things are surprising. I don't think it has anything peculiar to do with whether contradictions so defined can be true.
So I think it's fair to say that this discussion is going to be fairly complex. So I think it would pay dividends to carefully define all the relevant terms, lay the groundwork. So what is dialetheism in a nutshell?
Well, I should say that I myself am not part of that ism, that the term that was coined by Graham Priest and Richard Routley and used by people early on. So let's think just briefly. I mean, truth value gaps have been around. Aristotle's sea battle. Is it true that either there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or is it false? Is it true that it will either be a sea battle tomorrow, or it's false that there will be a sea battle? Some people think, well, it's neither true nor false. It's a gap. Truth value gluts are just gaps in the mirror. I mean, gluts are cases where it's both true and false instead of neither true nor false. And the first person in contemporary, he was actually a mathematician at the University of Pittsburgh, Florencio Asenjo. He's the first person who put forward the idea that true mathematics is full of gluts, not gaps, but gluts. sentences that are both true and false. And he pointed to things like Russell's paradox, a set of all things that's not a member of itself, and so on. And actually, he gave the first sort of logic that could, not the first logic. That goes way back to a student of Łukasiewicz. But he gave a logic that accommodated this and just said, well, you got your things that are just true and just false, and you have these things that are both. We shouldn't run from them. We should acknowledge them. And so, he didn't come up with some term that had, there was no term for gap theory to acknowledge the existence of truth-value gaps. And he didn't think that there needed to be a term for glut theory, the existence of truth-value gluts. And I'm of the same mindset. I don't see why there needs to be a special sort of ism or philosophy that goes with it. Now, Priest and Routley, those are two pioneering glut theorists without whom much of glut theory would just be a lot worse than it is. And they're not by themselves. I mean, people like Ross Brady, Chris Mortensen, and many others. They were part of a program of you could never have a meta language. You could never have, you could have one, but the necessity of having a meta language to get at the truth of natural language was that they were full on against that. And that's what this dialetheism stuff is about. Graham, of course, he coined the term, he and Richard Sylvan, they'd like the term to be used more widely, but I actually think it's misapplied. Priest himself thinks that part of a so-called dialethic solution to certain things involves a rejection of meta-languages. And I think we need meta-languages. I think Tarski was right about a whole lot of things. And so I'm just a glut theorist. I'm not part of the special dialethic program or anything. So I've said a whole lot of background. If you want to ask, I don't actually know your sort of audience, like what level they're at. So if we need to step back, that's
Sure.
fine.
Probably a little slower, but because if nothing else, I need it to be a little slower because this area is well outside my area of expertise. But it's my understanding, though, that dialetheism, at least given the definition that Graham gives in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is just the view that there are true contradictions. So insofar as we accept that minimalist definition, would you in that sense call yourself a dialetheist?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, what's the term for the gap theorist who thinks that there are gaps?
Well, so maybe
So I mean, and the reason I say that is, Graham on one hand wants the term to be used just for any glut theory, which is, glut theorist is one who accepts the existence of gluts.
And a glut here is?
A sentence that's true and false, or strictly a sentence that entails a contradiction,
right? Okay.
In the sense that we defined, a formal contradiction. But if you look at Zach Weber's great book, Zach is part of that dialethic program. I think Zach took over writing the SEP piece, but if you look at his book, Paradoxes and Inconsistent Mathematics, I think. It's a great book, but there, he quotes Priest as saying that part of that program, or implicitly saying that part of that program is a rejection of meta languages, this and that. So I just don't think you can have it both ways. And the term glut was coined by Kit Fine back in the 70s, shortly after Asenjo published his paper on accepting, he called them antinomies, but accepting gluts. So I think we can distinguish. Dialetheism is one particular version of glut theory, but there are glut theorists who think that Tarski was right about language and that meta languages are necessary, that there is no special ism associated with accepting that there are true contradictions, any more than there's an ism involved in accepting that there are true conjunctions or that there are untrue conjunctions. Or let's put it this way. There has never been a special ism associated with accepting that there are untrue contradictions, that is, contradictions that are neither true nor false. You don't get suddenly a philosophy or a special project by thinking that there are contradictions that are true and false.
But we would still call that view glut theory. You'd be a glut theorist if you affirmed that.
Yeah, that's the general thing. In the same way that you can be a gap theorist. And one way of being a gap theorist is to be associated with intuitionism about mathematics. That's a special ism that fuels a particular way of spelling out gap theory and particular dogmas and doctrines that go with it. But you wouldn't call a gap theorist an intuitionist any more than you should call a glut theorist generally a dialethist. I mean, again, I just want us all to be clear. And there's been so much, I think Priest, well, Routley too, and Mortensen and many others, but Priest has done such remarkable work in glut theory and spreading it to different areas. But one effect of that is a sort of conflation of these basic points that I think matter, because I've given so many talks where people ask questions about Buddhism and this and that, and I'm like, why would you think that anything I said had anything to do with Buddhism? And they said, I thought that that's what dialetheism is. Now, to be fair, dialetheism has nothing essential to do with Buddhism, as Priest and Routley and Weber now have defined that dialetheism. But you can see how the slip, once you have a grand ism and it's associated a lot with different, I mean, I did some applied work in philosophical theology recently, and if you were to start thinking that dialetheism has to do with Christian theology or something, that would be crazy. That's why I say we should just keep glut theory, gap theory, and then if you have a special ism within either one of those, intuitionism on the one side, the dialethic program against meta languages on the other, great. But the general picture is you just have this question, right? You have a bunch of conjunctions. Some of them are of the form, it's true that P and it's false that P. Here are two questions that have come up in philosophy. If we're giving the truth about the world, are any of those contradictions untrue? That is, are any of those contradictions unfalse? That's what I meant to say. They're neither true nor false. Yes, that would be a gap theorist. What about, are any of them true? Yes, that would be a glut theorist. That's really the basic, simple question. And sorry for, I misspoke earlier when I said the gap theorists say that contradictions, sentences of the given form that we've talked about, those are untrue. I meant to say unfalse.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Does that
So,
help?
yes, I mean, one thing that's not clear to me because this is my actual training in logic, anyway, just classical logic, is not astounding, is that I'm not familiar, at least in the most rough and ready way, with the distinction between a language and a meta language. For my own edification, what does that mean? What are we referring to here?
Great. Yeah. Um, so these are terms that the logician, he wasn't really a philosopher though, had philosophical views. The logician Alfred Tarski had back in the day. There were questions about, and some of this sort of spilled over from logical positivism and stuff about whether, and worries about could you define truth and this and that and the other thing. And Tarski went about just very precisely not defining truth, but truth in and for a particular language. That might sound like the same thing to you, and it would be a real detour for us to like go into that, so let's not. But the basic idea is this. Usually the problems with defining truth have to do with standard paradoxes. Once you have a predicate is true, unlike, by the way, logic's truth connective, it is true that. Once you have a predicate in the language, the difference between a predicate and a connective is the predicate can be very creative. If you have a predicate, all you need is a name. If it's a unary predicate, it takes one name to make a sentence. If you have a unary predicate, all you need is a name, and the grammar will say, yep, you got a sentence. Okay, well, let's have a falsity predicate in the language, which we can define once we have a truth predicate. And now just put in a name, to use an example of Saul Kripke's, Bob. And now the grammar tells you that the sentence Bob is false, is a sentence, because it's a unary predicate preceded by a singular term. But now, again, I'm just repeating a good example of Kripke's. We have the power using the language to just name that very sentence Bob. So now you have Bob is identical to the sentence Bob is false. Okay, what do you do? Well, if classical logic is, rules the day, then that sentence is true if and only if false, and because it's classical logic, it's got to be one or the other, so it's both. Okay, what do you do? Looks like you can't define truth or falsity in and for a language. And Tarski said, that's right. You can't do it in the language for the language. You have to go to a different language to define truth for that language. And I'm going up and down because the standard sort of metaphor of Tarskian languages is this hierarchy. And so he has this result that I'm going to put in a way that's, well, I won't even tell you the result, but it basically just says if you combine classical logic with a truth predicate or falsity predicate, where you have resources that can name their own sentences, you're going to have problems. So he said, to give the truth about truth, you have to be in a different language. And the meta language from the Greek under above, that's the language in which you give your theory of truth for the object language. So the simple distinction of an object language and a meta language is just the object language is the language you're using, and the meta language is the language you use to talk about the object language. So if you're learning French and your meta language is English, then French is the object language, English is the meta language. But any natural language, and Tarski made a big deal of this, any natural language has the resources to be its own meta-language. And Tarski said natural languages, the problem with them is that they're universal. That was his term, which meant basically anything you can say in any language, you can say in a natural language. And the most famous argument for gluts, I attribute, because I don't know of a preceding one, is due to Priest, who just uses the Tarski idea and says, look, English is universal, and so you can't have a meta language, so you have to be able to give a theory of truth in English itself, and that will wind up with contradiction. I think that's a great argument. It mirrors the argument that Aseno gave with Russell's sets, but Aseno was no philosopher, and Graham and Priest is a great one. Does that give you the distinction between object language and meta language?
Yes, I mean in that intuitive way where when you're first learning a concept, you get glimpses of it and then it fades and it takes time to sink in. But I think I get.
Just think, you and I are speaking English right now.
Yes.
If we want to talk about the term, the word philosophy in English, right? Well, we're mentioning the word philosophy, right? And we're going to talk about it. So we're using English as a meta language to talk about English itself. So English is both the object language and the meta language.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I've just drafted a book that sort of walks through this for the interested non-expert in philosophy. But I actually think that this idea of English is universal is both absolutely right, but also badly misunderstood. I'm not an historian of Tarski, but I think there's a way of understanding the universality of English that sort of reflects the problem with Priest's argument from semantic closure. I still think there are gluts, and I still think that the right account of logical consequence is paraconsistent and paracomplete, but I don't think that argument works because it turns on a particular notion of universality of language that I don't think is right. But you let me know if I've answered your question. I'm still trying to gauge sort of where you want the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. I think where we're at, the level we're taking it to, where you've gone is right. I don't think we're too far in the weeds. But I will say, if that's not where the area of that's not a claim you make, this dialethic rejection of meta languages, then we can table it for now, because I think
correct. Yeah.
What most people want to know are what are some claimed examples of true contradictions that you would affirm, or that the glut theorists in general have affirmed. I think you touched on or gave a version of the liar paradox, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe we start with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, it's just like, think about gap theorists, right? You wouldn't say, oh, well, what's the leading example? It depends on who the gap theorist is.
Sure.
Intuitionists in mathematics will point to mathematical examples, but people dealing with vagueness or whatever, they'll point to vague predicates in natural language. So I don't think that there's one. Again, this is another problem with the kind of conflation of the ism and glut theory generally, is it kind of makes you think that it's this big team of people. And I think everyone's just after the truth, and they're not, it's not like It's not like here's our mascot or anything. But that said, I personally think that the best example of a glut in natural language is liar-related paradox. For what it's worth, Priest himself has told me over the years a number of times that he thinks that the best example is legal gluts, which I'm happy to briefly mention if you want. But the take a simple liar, the one that we just reviewed, right? I mean, you got a sentence there that says I'm false. To me, okay, I think that excluded middle is, I think that there are gaps. I think that that's a logical possibility that it could be neither true nor false, okay? Priest rejects that. He doesn't think it's even logically possible that there can be gaps. And that's a Senho's position too, the sort of first glut theorist. And same with Zach Weber, and I should say a former me, but I think that's really imbalanced. Okay, you can come back to that if you want, but I believe that there are gaps as logical possibilities. So when you see a sentence like I'm false, there's a logical possibility in which it's gappy, there's one in which it's glutty. Which one do you go with? For me, I think that in general, we follow three very familiar methodological rules of thumb. One is pursue consistent theories. When you're trying to build your theory, try to avoid putting both P and its logical negation in the theory. So the first rule of thumb is avoid gluts if you can. The second methodological rule of thumb is pursue complete theories. It's just the dual of the first one. In the language of the theory for any sentence P, try to get either P or its logical negation in the theory. I mean, you're trying to give the full, true theory of the phenomenon. So that second methodological rule of thumb, pursue completeness, is generally against gappy theories. And the last, third familiar and traditional rule of thumb is pursue simple theories, pursue natural theories. You know, don't think about Occam-like things, right? You don't try to just complicate the theory if you can avoid it. So you got three methodological rules of thumb, and we're sitting here looking at this phenomenon, I'm false, right? It's a sentence of the language. What do we do? Well, I think we do what we always do. There's no hard and fast rule that tells us what's true. So we look at reality. Sometimes it bucks. It doesn't allow you to satisfy all three methodological rules of thumb. And so we have to figure out which one should we buck. Those who just absolutely are convinced, for no argument that I've ever seen, I would love to see one, but for those who are so convinced that the classical logic story is the right story of logical consequence, you know, they have to reject the first option right off the bat. That is, they have to reject bucking the first one. They have to hold that tight. And they have to hold the second one tight in a sense. And so they wind up often giving up on natural, simple theories. And that's Tarski's is often said to be very complicated and so on. My own view is, look, the liar could be a gap, sure, logically, but when you look at the thing, it's just a sentence that says I'm false. That thing, if anything looks like a glut, it's that. And I think the simplest, most natural account of it is it's a glut. It's true and it's false. And it's like So what's the problem? I mean, you just have this weird little thing that's true and false. That's fine. Consider the dual, a truth teller. I'm true, right? That's a sentence in the language. What is it? Well, again, it could be, you can assign it any of the sort of four options that logic gives you. It can be just true, it can be just false, it can be both, it can be neither. But to me, it just kind of, it just looks like, to me, it just kind of looks like a gap. So I treat that as a gap and the liar as a glut. And I think that many glut theorists would think that many instances of liar kind of phenomena are glutty. They're both true and false. Yeah. So does that answer the question? Or I don't know how to. I don't know how much background to give when giving these answers.
I mean, I can follow. So I'm having a good time. But there are so many directions we could go in. But let's continue along the kind of groundwork level of so what are some examples from law? I had somebody ask that question they wanted me to ask you about. What are some legal examples of potentially true contradictions?
I think it's something like in early, so this is an actual case, by the way. Okay, I'm going to get the details wrong,
It's fine.
but you'll get the idea, okay? The actual case was something along the lines of you had a law in Australia to the effect that only landowners could vote, okay? And then another law where no women can vote. And then lo and behold, you have a woman who is a landowner. And so by law, it's true that she can vote. And by law, it's false that she can vote. I think that's the general shape of the case. I haven't thought about it that long, but you can see if
Yes.
that's not the case, you can make one up. But that's actual. There are actual cases of these inconsistent laws. That to me is uncontroversial. Priest thinks that these are absolute best cases for gluts. Why? Because he said, doing semantics of a language, doing logic, doing all that stuff, that's hard, and there's a lot of things that can spin around and so on. But the law is there. You can read it. It's inconsistent, right? That body of law is inconsistent.
Yeah.
And so Priest thinks that laws give you gluts in an immediate way. So I'm not sure if your your listener or whatever wanted just the example or wanted my opinion on that.
Well, so let me first act as if you're defending this, because I have a pretty visceral reaction to the example of laws as supposed true contradictions. To me, it seems like that just makes the case for contradictions way too easy. I mean, laws are human conventions, inventions, things we just come up with and stipulate as true, and then we all act as if are true and binding. But like, why is an example of an inconsistent set of laws in a country, say? Why is that any more significant than a book where some author writes two sentences that are contradictory to one another? I mean, could you really point to that book and say, look, I've proven gluts? I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem that significant, even though I might struggle to spell out why.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. So you and I are sitting in exactly the same position on this.
Okay.
And in fact, the way you put it is interesting because it's the way I've looked at it really myself. suppose that Christians or Muslims or some religious group, suppose that they're right about everything, and
Hmm.
so their book, right? That book, if it says it there, then of
Yes.
course, okay, you've established it. Okay, but I agree with you. That's a big if, and short of that kind of stuff, what are we left with? So my response to Priest's argument from the law or legal context, I said exactly as you did. I said, look, I mean, I put it in a slightly more sort of logic-y way. Um, think about this. We don't we don't think that it's 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 true that there's a magical table simply because, according to Harry Potter, according to the Harry Potter story, it's true that there's a magic table. By
Right.
the way, I was thinking of the dining table in that one thing, but anyway, um, so but notice that if we say according to the true theory of everything, there's a magic table. Okay, then there's a magic table, right? So the difference is you have this according to the story
Yes.
operator.
Yes.
And the law is exactly the same. This is the way I was looking at, which it sounds like you were on exactly the same page as I was thinking. Um, so according to law, P. It doesn't therefore follow the P. So even if according to the law P and not P, it doesn't follow. That contradiction doesn't, you can't pull it out any more than you can pull out the existence of a magical table from the truth that according to Harry Potter stories, there's a magical table. Um, Priest, I think Priest replied saying that, okay, fair enough, but we can restrict it to special sort of regions like here. If you and I, right, and your audience are governed by some special body of law, then and that law is inconsistent, then that he thinks that has that kind of release feature where according to the story, P entails P. That's all I mean by release. It releases the thing it's operating on. Um, I don't see it, and I can't remember whether I actually replied in turn, but there's since been further debate by J.J. Joaquin, at De La Salle University in the Philippines, and Brad Armergarb at one of the SUNY schools, Albany, I think. Um, and there's some interesting stuff that's being debated about that. But I still sit with you. I just don't see how you can get it. There was, by the way, on your point, there was also a paper which I don't know, I don't understand how. I guess I just don't see it. I was surprised it was published, but um, anyway, that paper tried to show that you can have, even outside of legal context, so long as you make a social contract,
Right.
you can immediately not. By the way, it's not. This isn't raised as an objection. The authors of the paper, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the title and all that, but they were actually arguing that this is a clear case for gluts. You just make a social contract that winds up inconsistent. I still sit with your sort of gut reaction. I just
Yeah.
don't think the world is that easy. And if it's that easy to get gluts or gaps, then okay, fine. But then there's nothing interesting. Like we should focus
Yeah.
on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm exact same page with you, so I'm happy to just stipulate we found the truth on that one. What about paradoxes of motion? That was intriguing to me as a possible example. I mean, what are they, and do you think they give us genuine contradictions?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm ultra conservative. So Graham is the ultra liberal. I don't mean these in political terms.
Sure.
I just mean, his whole career has been finding gluts everywhere. Whereas I've been just the opposite. Like I think sure there's logical possibility gluts, but there don't seem to be that many.
Mm.
But the paradox of motion, the Zeno stuff, which you can do it really formally or you can do it informally. And you look at the old Zeno paradoxes, and these are supposed to deliver gluts, tortoise in the hare or whatever. I think a kind of more interesting example is, and it's related, is I think this was Priest, maybe it's Weber, but is sort of in a door frame. Like you're in a room, right? Consider the room you're in now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now go stand right in the door frame of that room. Are you in the room? Are you out of the room? And if you actually think it through, your immediate thought is you want to do this sort of degree theoretically. Well, I'm in the room to degree whatever and out of the room to degree whatever. But if you think through that a little bit, there are problems with you being there to degree theoretically. And I think there is a case. I don't accept it myself, but I think that's more plausible than the Zeno examples, although maybe they translate into each other. But let's not go off on a tangent. I think there is an interesting question about, is it true that you're in the room and false that you're in the room at a certain point when you're moving through that door frame? I mean, right now you're in the room. We should reject the falsity of your being there. But, you get closer to the door frame, the exit, and is there some point at which it's false that you're in the room? Again, I don't know. I mean, for me, my natural inclination in that is to treat it as a gap rather than a glut. There's a gap somewhere where you're neither in the room nor it's, not in the room, however you want to put it.
Mm.
But yeah, so those are those examples.
Yeah, I too kind of look at that as maybe, but it would be harder to go with the reply here that we gave to the law examples. It doesn't seem that like being in or out of a room is a matter of convention, right? And so you couldn't analyze it in that way.
Mm-mm.
So
No, that's certainly right. And if you wanted to, everything would then become convention.
right,
So I agree with you there. But the question is it really a glut versus a gap?
right.
Or is it just degree theoretic, in which case neither glutty nor gappy? It's just you're in there to degree whatever and you're out of there to degree whatever. Maybe it's, yeah.
So I think we can step back and take on a more global perspective of the conversation here, in that you said something interesting about how we properly evaluate theories. And we have these three criteria, which was aim for the most consistency, aim for the most comprehensiveness, and then aim for the most simplicity. Is that kind of right?
Simplicity, naturalness, kind
Okay.
of those pragmatic things. Yeah, yeah.
So I think one argument raised against glut theory is that once you get a contradiction, anything follows. Or I suppose a variation on this is that glut theory can lend itself, in some sense, to trivialism, the view that every single proposition is true, every contradiction is true. And so I take it that the goal here is to have a situation where only some contradictions are true. We don't want to affirm that every single possible contradiction or contradictory pairs of statements are true. So how do we avoid that situation? That's my first question.
Right. No, that's well said. Look, the reason that let's think in terms of we're putting together a theory, and let's think of this as sets of sentences or statements or propositions, however you like to talk. Okay, and as we say, well, this is true, so we should put that in the theory. And this is true, we should put that in the theory. And you're trying to give not only a true description of whatever your target phenomenon is, but as you say, comprehensive. I use the term complete, but your word comprehensive is nice in this context. Okay, so where does the threat of triviality come from, and what is that? Every theory, again, thought of as a set of sentences and whatever, is going to have a language, okay? And the trivial theory for a language is just the entire set of sentences from that language, okay? So if we had three sentences, P, Q, and R, and nothing more in the language, the trivial theory would just be the set P, Q, and R. Okay. All right. Now, normally, though, we have at least the logical connectives, the ones that you get taught in absolutely elementary logic, even if it's just classical or whatever, they're just same standard connectives. You have these, let's assume that every relevant language has those in them. All right. When you're putting together your theory, you not only want to have it entirely true, that is, something's in there if and only if it's true, you want it to be complete, or in your words, comprehensive. You want anything that follows from those truths that are already in there, you want those in your overall theory, right? Okay. So this is what's called closing a theory. It's a sort of logic-y term. So you have a bunch of sentences. You can close the theory under a validity relation or consequence relation or entailment relation. So to close a theory under a consequence relation is just to do this. If sentence A, I guess I'm using P's and Q's here. So if sentence P is in the theory and P entails Q according to your consequence relation, then Q is already in the theory. That's what a closed theory under that relation looks like. It's completed according to that validity relation or entailment relation. Okay. Now, your question, what about trivialism? What about this and that? Well, take a language, and we've got P and its logical negation, not P, okay? And we put them both inside a theory. Mm-hmm. We think that P is glutty, so both it and its logical negation should be in there. Okay, Now let's try to close that theory under classical logic, okay? Under the relation, the validity relation, classical logic. Well, since P is in there and not P is in there, it's going to put their conjunction in there, right? Because arbitrary P and Q entail logical conjunction in classical, okay? But more importantly, in classical, because P is in there and its logical negation is in there, if you close it under that classical relation, every sentence in the language goes in. Because according to classical logic, arbitrary P and its logical negation together jointly entail every sentence in the language. That's just a classical validity. So
Right.
the trivial theory results from closing a negation inconsistent theory. That is, you got P and its negation. That's what it is to be negation inconsistent. The trivial theory results from closing a negation inconsistent theory under classical logic. Or, by the way, that's one of a gazillion that would lead to trivial theories. You close it under any logic according to which P and its logical negation give you arbitrary Q. Okay. So you started out by asking, there's a worry. We don't want everything to be true. We just want these certain gluts to be true. We don't want it to spread. We don't want it to be a problem. Well, that's right. If we're trying to just describe the truth and we've got a glutty phenomenon, we don't want the trivial theory. We just want the gluts that are in there. We want those to be true, but it shouldn't infect everything. You said, how do we avoid that? We avoid it by recognizing that we don't want to close that theory under the classical relation. And indeed, if you think that every true theory is closed under logical consequence, whatever logical consequence is, if you think that every true theory is closed under that, then you must think that logic itself is subclassical. It's sort of below the classical. I mean, you could think it's something wildly different, but let's keep our candidates in the realm of familiarity.
And that would be where you would introduce paraconsistent logic, right?
Yeah. So paraconsistent logic can be defined as a validity relation, consequence relation, entailment relation, whatever, such that arbitrary negation inconsistency does not imply does not validate triviality in the way that we discussed.
So, looking then at that first criteria of aim for the most consistent theory.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see where I'm going with this. What is the motivation for that criteria? Why should we adopt that in our theory evaluation scheme?
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned that I'm doing a book that's it's called From a Subclassical Point of View, and one of the chapters talks about these methodological rules of thumb and the general search for truth and when logic is subclassical. And one of the graduate students here at Notre Dame kept pressing me on that question, and now I'm worried that you've asked that maybe there's more of a question here. So the reason I didn't think that this is okay, I guess I'm gonna have to come up with something really figure this out. I mean, my own view is, look, if you look at our search for truth in general, right? these three rules: pursue consistent theories, pursue complete theories, and pursue natural, simple, beautiful theories. These have guided us, and for all that I see, they've guided us well. The fact that we recognize the logical possibility of gluts on one hand or gaps on the other, that in no way undermines the methodological rule of thumb of consistency or completeness. After all, there are logical possibilities that absolutely transgress what is theoretically possible according to current physics. But we don't somehow see a reason now to throw everything away. Now, somebody might say, well, the analogy's bad because think of the difference between Newtonian physics and relativity, right? And they're thinking of this as a difference between when we thought logic was classical and now we think it's subclassical, allows for gluts, allows for gaps or whatever. And somehow we had to change a lot. But what we changed was what we think is true, and accordingly what the relevant theoretical possibilities are given the current theory. We didn't change the space of logical possibility. But anyway, I can tell that I'm probably thinking too far out. So here's my answer. What reason do we have to now give up that methodological rule of thumb?
Oh, what reason do we now have to do so?
Yeah.
I mean, so my worry about that criteria is that for me, if you ask me why I would pursue consistent theories, I would reply by saying because it's impossible for an inconsistent theory to be true. And so, of course, we need our theory to be consistent. If we could show it inconsistent, an inconsistency arising from it, we would know automatically it's false. Once we give that up, though, I no longer see why we should adopt consistency as a relevant criteria or how we could possibly motivate it.
Good. Let me let's be careful here. That's an excellent response. I just want to get clarification on it. Mm-hmm. When you say it's impossible, I think that there are many. I think the contradictions are impossible in mathematics. So contrary to the first, as far as I know, Glut theorist, Aseno, I think that contradictions are impossible in mathematics. And that's contrary to Zach Weber at Otago, contrary to Graham Priest in New York, and others, okay? So I think they're absolutely impossible. When we hit a contradiction, we've gone wrong. But, and I would say the same in physics, but I'm not expert I'm not expert enough in mathematics to absolutely know for sure, but I mean, I just gave you my own view, and I would say the same of physics for all that I can tell. Might I be wrong? Sure. But, you have to go with what you think is true and you move forward. But I would in no way say that contradictions are logically impossible. That is, by that I mean, say that something's a logical possibility if and only if it's a possibility recognized by logical validity. That is, so think of logical validity when you learned about it. It's right, A logically entails B if and only if there's no counterexample, right? Well, this space of counterexamples strictly is A logically entails B if and only if there's no relevant counterexample. What does that mean? Well, for logical validity, the space of relevant counterexamples are all the candidate counterexamples that logic recognizes. So if I'm right, it recognizes possibilities in which P and not P, logical negation P, are true. It recognizes possibilities in which those are neither true nor false, and so on. And notice, logic says nothing about particular predicates or anything that it doesn't say about all predicates. This is a different topic, but the logic gets to be universal by saying very, very little. Traditionally, it's been called topic neutral. Okay, so I would never say that contradictions are logically impossible, but I think that there are many true theories where those logical possibilities are removed and treated as theoretical impossibilities. What does that mean? It means that as far as the theory's consequence relation goes, those aren't relevant. It just doesn't look at them, okay? It treats them as impossibilities. So mathematics, I think, does that for gluts and gaps. Physics, I think that does similarly, though I defer to physicists and philosophers of physics who actually know physics well. Now, let's get back to your statement. You asked, why should we give up, or why don't we just give up the methodological rule of thumb that pursues consistency? And I said, I don't see a reason. And you said, well, here's a reason. You were just speaking, on behalf of yourself or a would-be position that you're inclined to take. Here's a reason. Contradictions, understood as we defined them early on, cannot possibly be true. There's no relevant possibility in which those are true. And indeed, you think there's no possibility, period. That needs argument, especially when we're talking about the viability of some pretty live candidate theories for different things. And here's why I don't think you're going to have a good argument, okay? I'll try to do this really simply. Do you want me to proceed?
Yeah.
Or okay. The best argument you would give, I think, maybe you'll surprise me, which would be fantastic because it would be great if there were a good argument for that. But here's the best argument that I imagine, that I've been able to imagine. The reason we should reject even the logical possibility of gluts or true contradictions is the very meaning of logical negation and logical conjunction, but the very meaning of logical negation. If you look at the meaning of logical negation, you just can't have something being both true and false. Or for that matter, you can't have it being neither true nor false. That would be a great argument if the very meaning of logical vocabulary ruled out logical formal contradictions being true. That would be powerful. And as a matter of fact, I'd want to just talk about something else, or maybe not talk, go out and do something outside, whatever. But here's why that argument fails. The truth and falsity conditions for logical negation are exactly the classical logic truth and falsity conditions. What are they? Well, they're the ones you always learned. A negation, a logical negation is true at a possibility if and only if the negatum, the thing that the negation operates on, the sentence embedded, if and only if the negatum is false at that possibility. So let me say that again. Logical negation is true at a possibility if and only if the negatum is false there. A logical negation is false at a possibility if and only if the negatum is true there. Those are the classical conditions. I think that those are exactly right. But notice they do not rule out gluts and they do not rule out gaps. Why? Suppose that you've got a sentence, P, that's both true and false at a possibility. Well, all that the truth and falsity conditions for logical negation tell you is that if P is both true and false at that possibility, then so too is its logical negation. Because if P is false there, then its negation is true, and if P is true there, its negation is false. So it just tells you if P is a glut at a possibility, so is its negation. But that doesn't rule out gluts. Likewise, imagine that P is neither true nor false at a possibility, right? Completely compatible with truth and falsity conditions. After all those tell you is that if P is neither true nor false at a possibility, then so too its negation is neither true nor false there. So just to wrap that up, I think the best argument you could give is from the meaning of logical negation. But that argument is just not going to go very far because we agree on the meaning, at least if truth and falsity conditions are the meaning, and assuming that you subscribe to the classical truth and falsity conditions.
So I have more of a meta objection for you, which I don't know if anyone has made before, and they may have in a different way of phrasing it, but here we go. I'm going to give this to you. We'll see what you think. So I said that another concern I have is that warrant from paradoxes of self-reference, no matter how strong, won't outweigh our initial warrant for affirming the law of non-contradiction. And so it'll never be rational to reject the law, no matter what kind of putative counterexample you would give. And so I thought of the example Alvin Plantinga gives of like what he calls intrinsic defeaters. And so you can imagine that you're standing trial for murder. Now, from memory, you know you didn't commit the murder. But suppose that the prosecuting attorney brings DNA evidence. It shows that your DNA was present at the crime scene. And maybe even brings an eyewitness that says he saw you there at the time of the murder. Now, you still know you didn't commit the murder. Even though you don't know how to explain these pieces of evidence, your warrant from memory for thinking you didn't commit the murder is so strong that it just outweighs whatever warrant these pieces of evidence might provide for thinking you're guilty. And so I wonder if you could say the same sort of thing about the truth of contradictions, the truth of the law of non-contradiction, that, I mean, if anything has supreme warrant or justification, it seems to be this. And so even if you give me really clear putative counterexamples or instances of contradictions from the liar paradox or legal paradoxes or whatever, I would just say, yeah, it doesn't outweigh my initial warrant for this law. I don't know what you would make of that kind of move. I don't know if that's a fair move, but it is a move in this chess match.
I think that it's, fair, whatever. I think it's interesting. I myself, when I look at epistemology, whether so-called traditional or formal, I don't know that we really want to be constraining our pursuit of truth based on these epistemologies. But that's not to say there isn't a true epistemology. And it could be something along the lines that you were sketching. So I guess my question, I can't really say what I think of that response in depth before I know exactly what the warrant for this supposed always and everywhere rejection of contradictions comes from. I a few minutes ago was talking about the best argument I've ever seen for that sort of position tries to argue from the very meaning of the logical vocabulary. But that's not going to work. So before your proposed, epistemology-based rejection of contradictions goes forward, I think that you have to spell out where exactly this warrant comes from. Now, if you want to say it's properly basic or whatever Plantinga said, okay, you can say that. I myself kind of think it's, whether something's properly basic is maybe I'm misunderstanding or misremembering that term, but whether something's properly basic, I think is kind of relative to one's current epistemic position and theories. And at this point, I think that someone would really not be pursuing truth if one thought that they should all out reject contradictions without actually thinking through the matter. I'm not saying that's what you were doing, by the way. I'm just saying I could see somebody answering the question about what warrant is by saying, well, it's, whatever the right terminology is for, I don't have to answer that because it gets treated this way in my epistemic framework. Okay, fine, that's you,
Sure.
But, I want to know, what is the good reason you think for rejecting all these contradictions? If there is one, then run your epistemic thing.
I guess if push came to shove, I would say that the justification for believing in the validity of the law of non-contradiction is just a priori. That when we contemplate the law, we can see that it's true. And so maybe that's an appeal to philosophical or intellectual intuition. We just can see that it's true when we contemplate it. And so
Yeah.
if there's ever a time where we have a priori knowledge at all, surely it's this one. That would probably be my gun to my head.
Okay, so again, I think that's interesting and potentially important. But let me ask, exactly which law of contradiction are you talking about? Because there are different ways of formulating it, and you have to be the best way to formulate it, by the way, is to give you what you want is to formulate it as a validity statement from P and its logical negation that validly gives you arbitrary Q. That's the best, or if you want P and its logical negation give you arbitrary Q. To formulate it as just, well, there are no true contradictions, or there couldn't be, or whatever, you're using, instead of making a validity statement, you're using a statement that itself could easily be true and false. And in fact, every version of, whether you modalize it or whatever, of, non-contradiction, it 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 there are models in which it's true and false. That's why I say what you really want when you talk about the law of non-contradiction is arbitrary contradiction entails every sentence in the language of your theory. But let me ask you, so this a priori knowledge of the law of non-contradiction, what's the law that you have a priori knowledge of?
Well, I imagine the semi-informed philosopher on these issues would say something like, the law, as I'm thinking of it, takes the following form: that for any proposition P, P and not P cannot both be true.
What do you mean by cannot? Is that just logical negation? Same not?
That's a good question. I don't know.
But see, if it is, then that like any of the standard subclassical logics will be ones in which that has models in which it's true and false. That's what I'm saying. So, but also just note that your version of non-contradiction off the top of your head there, it involves various negations. And if you have a priori knowledge of its truth, but not a priori knowledge of exactly what those negations are and how they behave and what their entailment behavior is, doesn't that kind of give you pause about the claim that you've got a priori knowledge of the law to begin with?
Perhaps. Maybe. I'll give you a solid maybe. So what I want to talk about here, I think we would be remiss if I didn't bring up the application you've made of glut theory to philosophical theology. So my master's degree specifically is in philosophical theology, philosophy.
Oh,
of religion.
wow. Oh, I didn't know
And so, yeah, and so I don't know your work, and I'm not an expert in philosophical theology. I'm not like dragging the degree out to say, look, see my credentials. I just mean it's a fascinating area for me. And if I'm not mistaken, you've argued that we can construe the incarnation, that is to say, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, taking on human nature, the idea that Jesus of Nazareth is both God and man. We can construe that as a literally true contradiction. Now, first of all, is that a roughly correct characterization of your view?
Yeah, except you can drop the construe. I think that the best and most accurate description of the incarnation, the incarnate God, second person of the Trinity, is that you have a contradictory being. Yeah, and yeah, I wrote a whole book on that. Yeah. And you're right to mention second person of the Trinity. It's interesting that the contradictions aren't obvious in the Trinity when you actually sit through, like really, really go through that. But there are contradictions in the Trinity as well. And that's a follow-up book called Divine Contradiction.
So what do you say to the atheist that says that a contradiction in the very notion of Jesus being God and man, well, that gives us overwhelming reason to reject Christianity. Therefore, Christianity is false. What do we say?
Well, I think they're right. It's a contradiction, but I mean, I then repeat the same thing I said to you. Why, like, yes, and normally we're pursuing consistent, complete, simple, natural, beautiful theories or theologies in this case.
Sure.
And but if you look at the history of work on the incarnation, yeah, on the surface they look consistent. I mean, I think if you scratch a bit, the consistency starts to fade away. But leave that aside. Let's suppose they're consistent and complete. It's often you have this really complicated metaphysics and this and
Right.
that, or epistemology or whatever. And so I would say, yeah, I'd say, look, you have to actually pause and realize that you have no good reason to think that the so-called classical logic account of logical consequence is the right account. It's a very new invention by Russell and Frege in the 20th century. People talk about, yeah, but Aristotle held to non-contradiction, this and that. Aristotle put forth a bunch of different principles, and even by his own lights, didn't think that the arguments were any good. So, I think that this person, I'd say, you should, unfortunately, maybe think hard about why you think classical logic is the right view, given that the same truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary don't demand the logical impossibility of gluts or gaps. And once you allow those, or once you recognize that, I think, a very weird and indeed, as far as I know, unique phenomenon like the incarnation, I think if you're trying to give a complete and consistent and simple and natural and beautiful account, I think you're forced to give up consistency. I mean, after all, it is kind of, even on the surface, I mean, it just looks, everyone, the atheist that you're talking about, but look at theologians. They're like, yeah, this really looks contradictory. We have to really we have to sort of figure out some metaphysics or some other explanation, or maybe go apophatic or something. I myself I think it's unfortunate. I think the way logic is taught, people actually think that what they're learning is classical logic is in fact has been around for a long. It hasn't. Even today, what we call classical logic contradicts stuff that they think that was in Aristotle or Aquinas for the Catholics. But anyway, so I would just say that. And suppose, though, your next question, the atheist says, oh, no, I think that logic is subclassical. We're on the same page there. Well, at that point, then I'm like, I can't help you. As far as I can tell, whether somebody believes a particular theology, that's an act of God. It's not, a person who thinks that they reason themselves into it. I mean, I guess Eugen Nagasawa, I think he claims to have reasoned himself into theism, but I find that very difficult to believe. Okay, so that's a big response to your simple question. Do you want to follow up on, or?
I wonder, though, how far you could take that strategy in reconciling various seemingly inconsistent aspects of a religious tradition. And I wonder if you could also do that by stepping outside the religious tradition and consider combining it with other religious perspectives. And so, for example, do you think someone could be an atheist and also an evangelical Christian? Could someone affirm atheism and evangelical Christianity? I would, seemingly you'd say it's contradictory. You can't do that. Well,
yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't answer in that way. I'd like to hold fixed. Well, yeah. Anyway, let me. So I think that's a very interesting question. My own view is that's an impossibility, but why? The reason is the true theory of what we can accept, what we can reject, and what we can do physically and mentally and all that. I think that that's an entirely logically consistent, contradiction-free theory. And so I think that's I think that somewhere along the lines, you can't be. I mean, unless the terms are defined in a silly way, but assuming a good definition of these terms, you can't be an atheist, that is, reject the existence of a God, and also be a theist, accept the existence of a God. So those two mental activities, the true theory of those treats them as consistent and exclusive. When you accept a contradiction, you're not sort of putting it into your theory and then swapping it out and like flickering back and forth. It's like, no, you put P in there and you put its logical negation. That's what it is. It's not radical. It's not crazy. It might not be right, but that's for us to, figure out. But there's nothing spooky or magical about it. And I think it's the same thing. You can't accept and reject something at the same time. It's the way we're built. Maybe if we'd been built differently, maybe we could. I don't know. But and by the way, I do think that thing that I just talked about is pretty common among all glut theorists and gap theorists, for that matter, about accepting and rejecting. That is.
So I should have asked this question earlier, but it's related to this point, that what happens when we ascend one level, so to speak, from glut theory and ask a question about glut theory itself? So if, somewhat informally stated, glut theory is the view that at least some contradictions are true.
Or yeah, at least some true theories are inconsistent. Either way is fine.
Sure.
Yeah.
So then what do we say about glut theory itself? Could somebody say that claim that some contradictions can be true, could they say that's true and it's also false? Like, what's the status of glut theory on this view? Is glut theory true, or is glut theory just true, or is it both true and false?
So I think the most helpful way to look at this is always in terms of, giving the true, and to use your word, which I think is good, comprehensive theory of a particular phenomenon. That phenomenon may itself be a theory. Remember when we talked about language and meta-language, and there's a theory, meta-theory distinction that goes hand in hand with that. So whether a theory is, so a glut theorist thinks that there are some true theories that contain gluts.
Something has fallen over your webcam slightly, and it's just covered.
Sorry. Yeah, that's
You're
my
good.
little, that my electrical tape closed the camera thing. That my highly accomplished friend who does work in AI and stuff told me to do long ago, so I do it. I don't know.
Fair.
Anyway, so I take your question to be, suppose that we think that we've got an inconsistent theory. It's true. We think there are contradictions in it, so we're glut theorists. Could we have? So the claim that theory is inconsistent or contains gluts, whatever, those claims, in my view, aren't always in the glutty theory, the inconsistent theory. They might be in a meta theory. So we go to a meta language and we use that language in our theory of that bottom theory. Okay. So your question is, could one think that the truth about that inconsistent theory is itself inconsistent? Or the truth about that glutty theory below is itself glutty? yes, one could think that. I don't see any examples right off the top of my head, but in theories where you want to, so theories that are capable of saying of themselves that they are glutty, um, um, if they try to do that using just simple logical vocabulary and a standard truth predicate, like, as you put it, there are gluts in this theory or something,
Sure.
right? That very sentence will itself likely be a glut. Just because of the way I'm thinking of the logical vocabulary and stuff, and it doesn't have to be. You can have frameworks where it wouldn't be, but normally in the kind of family of logics that we're talking about, it would be. I myself think that if we're doing semantics or something, and the term glut or gap is supposed to be doing explanatory work, it's supposed to be really explaining something. I myself think that these things are not only in a meta theory, but they are consistent. They are not themselves contradictory or gappy, for that matter. But I could see people in the Priest, Routley, Weber, that program, where they would say, no, of course those would all be inconsistent, and that's because their program doesn't allow them to have the truth of semantics and stuff being forced into a language that is beyond the object language, at least if it's natural language. Yeah.
Well, I had one more topic I wanted to briefly pick your brain on before I ask you a few questions from my listeners. The you touched on this at the very beginning as something that you don't have any deep thoughts about because you don't see the relevance. But I can't help but ask you if you see in glut theory kind of implicit support for Eastern philosophical or religious outlooks. I find it interesting that at least among the majority of adherents to Christianity historically, there hasn't been, like in Christianity, for example, there hasn't been a widespread tradition of affirming a literal contradiction at the heart of reality. Or maybe there was mystery, but it doesn't seem to be built in the same way that in Confucianism, for example, you have the quote that the way that can be spoke of is not the true way. But of course, you're speaking about the way when you make that claim. So there seems to be a contradiction just built in. Nagarjuna, a Mahayana Buddhist philosopher, once said that everything is real and not real, both real and not real, neither real nor not real. This is the Lord Buddha's teaching. So should we all be Buddhists, JC?
I think Buddhism has a lot to offer. If I look at my Buddhist friends, I think as a way of life, it seems to be pretty good, depending on where in the world you live, I suppose. But I don't think there's any. I mean, you're right that stuff invites glut theory, that sort of talk, in the same way that a sentence, the truth about this sentence is that it's false. I mean, that's just a complicated way of saying this is false. It just kind of, looks like a glut. But I disagree with you about the traditional monotheism. Though I must say I'm no expert I'm no expert, period. But I'm especially non-expert with respect to Jewish theology or Islamic theology. But with respect to Christian theology, I mean, if you look at the Catholic Church and the Protestant traditions that have affirmed a lot of what the councils, so-called councils, have affirmed, I mean, the fact, you know, Christ is man, Christ is God, and there's just one person here. So the moment you say Christ is man, Christ is God, you immediately think, okay, there are either two people here, or it's some hybrid nature, some new thing that's a combination of maybe like a Greek god, you know, it's kind of man, kind of divine. But all of those are explicitly rejected. And so you're left with the contradiction. Now, people who, again, you ask them why they are so wedded to this view that logical validity is the classical, this new classical story, and they'll say, well, it clearly was intended to be consistent or something. Well, I mean, in nearly the same breath, you also say that there are these mysteries. So that you hit a contradiction, and look, it's a mystery. God's ways are not our. And you'll also hear, presumably, that these councils are divinely inspired and all that. Look, if it was consistent, why not just say it? Why not make it abundantly clear? So anyway, I'm not rehashing those arguments, but I guess I do disagree with you, though, that it's in the most central documents of the Christian tradition, at least I'd say in the Christian tradition, contradictions are affirmed outrightly. It's just that everyone has been so worried about one, like, will they be considered rational if they're a theist? And then when people don't care what you think, that sort of thing, then they're not worried about that. But now they're worried about, will I be seen as some lunatic if I don't think that classical logic is right or something? I mean, that shouldn't be the worry. The worry should be what's true. And I just think these documents shout contradiction right on the surface as much as the Buddha.
Right.
It's just that the Buddha, Buddhists are more laid back than a lot of Christians and all that. And so the Buddha was more laid back in the terminology, I think. It's real, it's not real,
You make a good point. You make an excellent point. I mean, the Trinity has been seen as contradictory for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's still a common issue today that philosophers try to argue for. It's not resolved. So, that maybe an implicit claim of contradiction in Christianity, whereas it just seems that these are more explicit. They come right out and say it in the Eastern tradition from time to time. Yeah.
Well, again, I have seen. I'm tempted to dig this thing up from these a theologian in Edinburgh who was like, "Oh yeah, here are all these theologians, and they're like really explicit. Yeah, God is infinite and not infinite, and this and that, and God is Christ can sin and Christ can't sin. Like these are just just explicit. But of course, for reasons that I said, which I think are largely sociological or psychological or something, a lot of theologians have kind of run from that. And also they've been misled about what logic is and what it allows. But I grant you, Buddha's the stuff. I'm good friends with Jay Garfield and Graham Priest, and a former student of mine, Aaron Cotnoir, and some others who have all written on Buddhism and paroxysticity and stuff. And some of the stuff they point to is, it's just, it's waiting for somebody who can make precise, some of the logic. But anyway.
Well, wrapping things up, I have two viewer questions for you, not reviewer. The first is, what do people in logic wish that people outside that field knew?
So of course I'm tempted to say logic, but I think that the biggest thing is that logic. I think people still think of logic as rules of thought or something, and this has not been the case for forever. Like, well, not forever, literally, but for a long time. It's just a conflation. So logical consequence, remember how we were talking about closing a theory and stuff? I mean, logical consequence sort of can help complete a theory. It can give you the broadest space of possibility that your theories can then select from which space matters for the particular phenomenon. But logic, I think the biggest thing for people outside of logic to know is that logic is not a relation of this is a good reason for that. I'm delighted by finally the right algorithms were found to make neural networks like actually intelligent and all that, like current AI models. And the reason I'm glad about that is that it has very little to do with logic. Never did. Instead, it's just it's all weighting between various nodes and assigning probability to what comes next. That's not to say that logic isn't important. I think that every true theory, and I think that this is common in logical studies, every true theory is closed under logical consequence. So it matters what the right account of logical consequence is. Logical consequence gives you the broadest space of possibilities, so it matters. If you're just looking at a small space, in your short life, you're going to miss a lot that could very well be what is the true description of reality. So I guess I'd give that sort of answer.
How do Godel's incompleteness theorems relate to Glut theory?
Well, again, I mean, you ask, I think those who think that mathematics itself is inconsistent, they will think that these are proofs of gluts in mathematics. Or at least, sorry, I shouldn't quite say that. I should say that the general so-called incompleteness phenomenon, at least for some areas of mathematics, will be treated as a phenomenon of inconsistency. But to really spell that out is a little bit detailed. Let me just say my own view for the non-expert. I think that what Gödel's first incompleteness theorem shows is simply that some true classically closed theories are not prime. What is it for a theory to be prime? A theory is prime with respect to logical disjunction if and only if it contains that disjunction, if and only if it contains one of the disjuncts. So it's prime in a sense. A theory is prime with respect to logical disjunction if and only if it respects the truth and falsity conditions of logical disjunction. what Gödel showed is that in the first incompleteness theorem is that you've got, classically closed true theories of arithmetic that are not prime because they're classically closed, they contain the sentence A or not A for every A in the language of the theory, but they don't contain either A or not A. So they contain the disjunction without either disjunct. And, on the surface, that doesn't have anything special to do with gluts, in my view. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things to say about it, but I don't think it has anything especially interesting to do with gluts. But again, there are people like Zach Weber and Graham Priest and Chris Mortensen and others who, following the original glut theorist Florencio Asenjo, they think that mathematics itself is inconsistent. And so the pattern and phenomenon of displayed in Gödel's results, they would take to show contradiction, but I myself don't.
Well, JC, thank you for coming on the podcast. You've forced me to think through many of the assumptions I've taken for granted. And this conversation has been absolutely fascinating. So I think people will like it. But thank you. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, it's great. And and nice response to the legal gluts thing. That's, you were spot on in my view. Although there are a few glut theorists who would disagree, but of course.
We'll never have consensus.
Yeah.